No, at all. You're around. Oh, well, yeah, that's NREM right now. They're like the volunteer. What do you think? Oh, okay. It's okay. Yeah, you're right. I found no help. Good.
Wait as long as you need to. If you just want to wait, you can file and get.
Yeah. Like classic, wait till it's back. Okay. Aloha. Oh, is that the light or this one? This one. Thank you. Aloha, everybody. Welcome to this seminar. Thank you for coming to hear our friend and colleague Melissa Price from CTAR come to give a talk for us. Sorry. Many of you know Melissa, but let me give a brief introduction. She got her bachelor's of biology from Walla Walla University in Washington with a minor in chemistry, yay, physical science, and a PhD in biology from Loma Linda, where she did a dissertation on behavioral ecology, taxonomy, and conservation genetics. And she more recently got a certificate in decision analysis from the US Department of the Interior. Yeah, so she's now a tenured associate professor in NREM, and she's been just putting out a storm of research on birds, ungulates, even tree snails, mostly focused around conservation in Hawaii. And I know everyone is excited to hear from her. And thank you for coming back after 10 years to give us an update on your research. Welcome.
Thank you so much for having me here today. So, in 2012, I started a postdoctoral fellowship working on Hawaiian tree snails with Dr. Mike Hadfield, who I believe is on Zoom today. So nothing like having your mentors online to be just a little bit intimidating. I did phylogenetics and population genetics of the remaining species in the family, or I should say subfamily Achatinellinae. And it was a total of about 59 populations that I sampled across 26 species. And started in 2012, by about 2018, most of those populations had disappeared from the wild. And I think there's something about starting out your career, watching things go extinct, that you spent hours sampling. They seemed fine when I was out there. You could hike to a spot and see hundreds of them. And there's something about that that I think makes you realize what's at stake. And so I think it's no coincidence I started out studying kohuli. Kohuli is the Hawaiian word for the Hawaiian tree snails. With the kāko over the A, it translates to change or to alter. Without the kāko over the A, it translates to overturn, overthrow, capsize, or upset. We're living in a time of profound change. You are going to graduate and go into careers at a time when the stakes are really high. The problems that you can solve are all really hard. All the easy problems were solved before you arrived. The good news is it is job security for you because you can chew on these problems your whole career. And so I spend a lot of time thinking about ho'okohuli, or how do we create turning points, transformation, innovation, movement, and change. And I think in order to do that, the lens through which we view the world must change. How big do we dream? How do we view challenges? How are decisions made? Who gets to make those decisions? With whom do we collaborate? How do we predict outcomes? Which information matters? And how can we reduce uncertainty, which is the role of scientists, to make predictions easier? And so my lab's role has ended up focusing on which information is needed to improve wildlife management outcomes. We use a variety of tools, including genetics, behavioral ecology, distribution modeling, climate change models, sea level rise models, social sciences, and decision analysis. Basically, if there's a problem in front of us, we spend time asking, well, which tool is needed to help us bust through whatever barrier is standing in the way of recovery of this endangered species. And so what I've seen with this front row seat to all of these challenges that we're facing is that there is enough work for all of us for many, many, many lifetimes. And so rather than diving into any one of the projects that my lab is doing on water birds or pigs or all the different things that were mentioned in the introduction, I really wanted to spend this time showcasing a lot of the problems that we need your help with. These are really dire situations. And there's so many different tools in which we could address different aspects of these problems. And so I hope that you will get excited about different things that you could hop in on as I go through the lecture today. So I'm going to start off probably depressing the heck out of you just a little bit. I've had a front row seat since about 2017 to declines that have been occurring across plants, invertebrates, vertebrates. And as folks were mentioning these things to me in different meetings I'd be in, they'd say, oh yeah, it was 2017. And yeah, we detected 200 mosquitoes at the highest elevations of Kauai in our traps. Well, now this year, we're likely going to see the last of the akikiki, right? So these are really dramatic declines really quick. And I'd be in another meeting and hear about a different group. And so I'm going to walk you through those. And then I'll walk you through some of the processes we're using to help improve decision-making for managers, and then point you toward how you can co-develop research projects with managers. So Hawaii has 25% of the endangered species in the United States. Unfortunately, the funding for endangered species management is based off of land area and human population size. And so we get 3% of the nation's funding available to manage endangered species. The majority of these are plants and invertebrates, but as these tend to be understudied relative to vertebrates, you can assume that that number underrepresents the true number of endangered species for plants and invertebrates, and is a pretty fair assessment of the number of vertebrates, largely birds. We have one endangered bat as well. The threats are exactly as you might imagine, maybe things that all of you are working on: invasive plants, invasive animals, disease, land modification, car strikes, overcollection, contaminants. I'm sure you can add a few things to this list if you think about it. So how will climate change add to these stressors? There's three major ways that it adds to this. One is through rising temperatures. The second is through less, but maybe when it comes, heavier rains. And the third is through rising sea levels. So as I walk you through each of these taxonomic groups, you'll see that the mechanisms impacting them are all a little bit different, but all result in the same result of declines. So we know climate change is impacting species now. How bad is it? Well, for the Hawaiian honey creepers, which are probably the most well-known example, we had 56 species historically, 17 are extant today, 11 of these are threatened or endangered, 39 are extinct. The major threat is avian malaria, which is passed along by mosquitoes. And so even if you're able to resolve the issues of invasive predators such as cats, rats, and mongoose, even if you were to perfectly restore the habitat, you would still lose the majority of these species because within 2 weeks of exposure to avian malaria, many of them die. In 2015, Lucas Fertini and his team had modeled what end-of-century predictions of habitat were going to be. I want to point out a couple of things to you in this table. First of all, as is typically done in climate change predictions, it's modeled by end of century. So they're comparing trends from 1990 to 2010 with trends predicted for 2080 through 2100. So if we look at 4 specific species on here, Akeke'e, Akikiki, Akohekoi, and Kidiki, or the Maui parrotbill, all 4 of these species are expected to go extinct within 5 years without dramatic luck and miracles. We're working on some solutions. They're moving slower than we would like them to. So while we often describe this as end of century models, we're actually seeing these declines happen right now. So this is based off of forest bird surveys, intensive monitoring, color banding, territory mapping. And when I sent this out to my team of co-authors, one of them is Kelly Crampton, who's the Kauai Forest Bird Recovery Program Manager. And she said, please make sure they understand we're literally watching Akikiki go extinct this year. We had 24 that we were monitoring at the beginning of the season. They would set up ready to collect eggs to bring into the captive rearing program. One of the parents would disappear, and behaviorally, these are monogamous. So if one parent disappears, the other abandons. And so they're now down to 5 individuals, having started with 24 at the beginning of the season. And it sounds like from what she wrote in her email, they were unable to collect any eggs. And these haven't been super successful in captivity. What about seabirds? Seabirds give me a lot of hope. I don't know if you've hiked out to Kaena Point recently, but if you hike out there, you have a lot of hope. Here's these seabirds that have disappeared from the islands for a long time due to invasive cats, rats, and mongoose. And now you've got this predator-proof fence, well, I should say mammal-proof fence out there. And you've got the mole, the albatross coming back and nesting. If you get to go up to James Campbell, you can see where they've translocated chicks from the northwestern Hawaiian Islands of black-footed albatross. And those are now thriving in that environment as well. The challenge with albatross is they breed mainly in tropical waters, and they don't start breeding until they're 8 years old. So there's this big lag in detecting demographic change and responses to the management actions that you take. One of the major challenges that we're seeing is we've been monitoring them since Kaena Point fence was built, and actually a little bit before that as well. And I'm going to point out what's happening with El Nino and La Nina and the trends that we see on the y-axis here is the reproductive success, and then time is across the x-axis here. Sorry, y-axis is reproductive success, x-axis is time. And so El Nino and La Nina are changing in frequency, duration, and intensity. El Nino generally results in better reproductive success because cooler water results in more food availability closer to the colony. So the parent doesn't use up as much energy on themselves flying out to where they need to get food from. They're able to deliver more to the chicks. And in the La Nina years, you end up with lower reproductive success due to warmer water and less food. And so we know that over time, due to climate change, the waters are going to continue to warm. And so this gives us a preview of what might happen to food resources for our mole over time. The other thing that's happening in the northwestern Hawaiian Islands is a dramatic reduction in the area available for nesting. So this is just a 2-year snapshot. You can see in red circled the pipe that they used as a marker. And so you can see in 2019 where the pipe is at compared to 2020. So in the year that they started removing chicks to translocate them over to James Campbell for this translocation project, that same year they were watching dozens, if not up to 100 chicks washed into the ocean during high wave events. So this is happening again, right in front of their eyes, totally different mechanism than the forest birds, but starting about 2015 is when they started seeing these really major declines in breeding habitat. What about plants? Well, for a while, we've been aware that there were no overlap species whose current and future climate suitable habitat does not overlap, and so they need assistance to move up in elevation or to wetter areas where they might persist into the future. Matt Keir, who's the Plant Extinction Prevention Program Coordinator for the state, again, around that same time, 2018, when I was hearing from folks, we were in a meeting, he said, yeah, we lost probably 2 to 5 plant species last year. I have to decide whether I take seeds out of the seed bank and germinate them and try to put them back out on the landscape, or whether I work on saving the next 2 to 5 species that are likely to go extinct this year. There are over 300 plants on the Plant Extinction Prevention list. To be on that list, you have to have less than 50 individuals in the wild. In combination with this, we have at least 54 in what are called wink out species. These are ones with nowhere to go. So in other words, they're already living at the edge of their range, and we don't have any suitable habitat to shift them to at higher elevation. Concerningly, many arthropod species are dependent upon these plants. So when the plants wink out, for example, last year I was talking with one of the managers, and she said, yeah, you know, we just went up and checked on this population of the last 10 of this one plant species. They're gone. They disappeared over the last year, which means that we have this insect species dependent upon them. They're probably gone too. The challenge, I mean, I don't work on insects. Thank goodness I work on vertebrates. It's a little more, it's a little less challenging. But one of the things they told me is insects have such crazy life histories that let's say there's a population you haven't had time to go check on for 50 years, and you go up and you check on it. If it's not there, it could mean one of a couple things. One, it truly did disappear. 2, it's in a portion of its life history when it's undetectable. Or maybe it just shifted over to another spot. So really challenging monitoring efforts, really challenging management efforts. And further, similar to the seabirds, there are also populations, for example, of yellow-faced bees that occupy coastal areas. And so we had, for example, one species that was completely wiped out by a large wave event up on the North Shore. So that's arthropods. And back to Kahuli, which I started working on. So we were curious with these declines happening. We wanted to do climate change models, find out what might be happening into the future, where to put the predator-free enclosures that we know can protect them. And so we modeled current distribution based off of detections that have been done by surveys over the last 50 to 100 years. So we modeled current distribution, then we used climate change models to make predictions about where they would be in the future. These are species that are often single valley endemics. So it wasn't surprising to us that there was very limited small native ranges that were expected to be under current distribution. When we predicted future distribution, again, starting off with that small of area, it's not surprising that many of them were expected to blink out by end of century. And so we took these results and we presented them to David Sisko, the Snail Extinction Prevention Program Manager, and he said, oh, you're predicting today's distribution. He said all of those species that are predicted to be gone by end of century are actually gone from the landscape today. We've got 2 species highlighted in yellow that with pretty minimal management are actually doing okay across the landscape. And those were the ones predicted to have some habitat by end of century. Acatinella mescalina, which is on the bottom here, and it's the other one that has a yes in that mark, has been heavily managed by Oahu Army Natural Resources Program for the last 30 years. So they're also still present across the landscape, although mostly within predator-free fences that they built a couple decades ago at this point. So what became really clear is that the future is here now. Given these results and what David is seeing across the landscape, he's anticipating the near total extirpation of approximately 10 genera, not 10 species, 10 genera, nearly 100 snail species within the next 1 to 10 years. And given that these do really important ecological roles because of the limited number of species that made it here historically, and so they diversified to fill a lot of ecological roles, these could have really big cascading impacts across ecosystems. And so hopefully, in a very depressing way, I'm so sorry on a Friday afternoon, I have hopefully convinced you that we've got a problem. Species are declining very rapidly right in front of our eyes. And so as this struck me a few years back when we had the last species of Acatinella apex fulva disappear from the lab setting, he was named George after the tortoise, and so it made the news, international news as well. And I started thinking, we actually know how to save snails. You build a predator-free enclosure, you've got captive rearing, which is not comparatively difficult to do compared to some of these forest birds that got to fly 200 feet in the air and do a dance to actually be able to mate, right? And if the males can hear each other, they get all stressed out and they won't mate. So like they're really hard. Comparatively, snails are easy, and yet we're losing them, right? And so I started wondering, can we actually prevent extinctions? So pulled together a lot of the folks who are co-authors on this talk and identified for our 586 endangered and threatened species across the islands, how many of them do we know how to save and the technology exists today? We know how to save, but we haven't developed the tech yet. Think mosquitoes and avian malaria. We know the problem, we just haven't solved it yet. Or 3, we have no clue why they're disappearing. And so we can't even begin to ask the question about whether the tech exists today. So I'll show you a graph of what we found. Notice that the majority of it is green, meaning that for the majority of the species, we not only know what the problem is and know how to save them, but the technology exists today, which means it's just a failure of resources to actually get there. The yellow are areas that all of you need to be aware of because these are areas ripe for development, the yellow and orange. The yellow is where technology is needed. We know the problem, but we don't have the solutions developed yet. And the orange, which is a very small number of species, we have no clue what's going on, and heavy study is needed to figure out even why they're in decline. So this is really hopeful. This brought me to thinking about, okay, if we've got solutions for so many of these species, what's the problem? And so in 2016, I enrolled in the Decision Analysis Certificate Program at the National Conservation Training Center. If you end up working for Fish and Wildlife Service, National Park Service, any of the Department of the Interior organizations, you can go take classes there and they'll usually pay for you to go. They do allow outside folks, such as academics or others, to enroll in their programs as well. And so this was a really great way of getting training while I was doing my postdoc and starting out in my professor position. And so what was brought to my attention is that not all actions are created equal. So do we know what the problem is and we have the tech? Yes, but not all the tools work the same, right? So let's think about a rat trap, an A24. So rat traps are aimed at rats. That A24 trap costs about $200. It's a repeater trap with a CO2 cartridge. If you want to know how it works more, we can talk more later. It's not too much per trap, and you only have to go up every 6 weeks to check on it, but it largely just targets rats. In contrast, a mammal exclusion fence excludes all the invasive mammals, but it has a much higher upfront cost. It's not a perfect solution. You still can have barn owls or poeo fly in and predate on the seabird chicks or something like that, but it keeps out the major predators that are causing these major declines. So the challenge is we're not usually just managing invasive mammals. We have hundreds of species we're trying to manage. We have hundreds of potential actions we could take for those different species, and we have multiple islands and multiple regions across those islands that we could manage. For those of you who have done a little bit of GIS analysis or a little bit of modeling, if you've got one thing you're trying to do, like optimize where to build a fence, not too hard. You can use your GIS tools. When you think about the factorial of hundreds of species, hundreds of locations, and hundreds of actions, it's literally more possible combinations than there are stars in the sky. You cannot brute force your way to answers on this. And so there are colleagues at the University of British Columbia and elsewhere. This has been applied in Australia and applied in New Zealand, where they've used a process called priority threat management. And in this process, we take species and group them up according to how they respond to threats and actions to address those threats. We then come up with 15 to 20 strategies, spatially explicit actions that say one might be aimed at small mammal control, another one might be aimed at ungulate control, another one might be aimed at disease management or something like that. So there's kind of themes along those. And then you elicit the cost and feasibility of each action set. As pure scientists, we'd rather not think about the cost of doing these things, but cost can often be a barrier to actually solving the problem. So we need to think about what the cost is of these things, as well as the feasibility. Maybe there's a silver bullet, but it's totally socially unacceptable. So what's going to happen right now today, I believe the Board of Land and Natural Resources is meeting over the Kauai Forest Bird EA environmental assessment for whether or not they can actually use the Wolbachia mosquitoes that technology has developed to help combat avian malaria. Okay, so that's a feasibility issue. If you can't get public approval on this, you actually can't use the thing that the scientists put in all this effort to invent. So cost and feasibility of each action set, benefits across species groups of each action set. In this case, we're interested in gains in recovery or gains like a reduction in probability of extinction, something you would usually do with like a population viability analysis. And this is a process described as priority threat management. That's a decision analysis process. So we've had the privilege of being able to apply this for the first time in the Hawaiian Islands across the 4 islands of Maui. So Scott Fretz, the branch manager for Division of Forestry and Wildlife, gave us a grant to do this so that we could pilot this approach. And so overall, big picture, our goals are to figure out which conservation actions have the highest conservation benefit per cost, the number of species that benefit, and the net gains in recovery of target species. As a side benefit, as a scientist, I'm really interested also in where more research is needed. So these are the areas of huge uncertainty that if we knew whether something is on this end of the spectrum or that end of the spectrum, it would make a huge difference, not only in what decision we made, but in the outcome of that decision. And so those are areas that are really ripe for conservation research. So Maui Nui has over 200 species that are likely to go extinct in the next 20 years in the absence of conservation action. And so we grouped those up into 18 species groups that respond more or less the same to management action. So vertebrates got divided into 4 groups. Invertebrates got divided into snails, 4 groups of insects, and 3 groups of aquatic species. And plants, oh my goodness, there's like between 100 and 200 species of plants. And so this was a little bit of a nightmare. And as we were thinking about how to group them, what we ended up doing is like a kind of like a principal components analysis approach where we looked at the different threats they were facing and essentially clumped them by shared threats, which the managers actually said that in and of itself was a huge insight for them that'll help them a lot. So what I'm going to show you, I'm going to walk you through this graph. So on the x-axis here is the total cost over 20 years. And I mean, we worked on everything. How much does it cost for the captive marine facilities, for the nurseries to grow the plants, for the personnel, everything from the techs up to the admin time, the equipment that it takes to do this. So all of that is included in this cost. And on the y-axis is something that will be very unsatisfying to scientists, but it's the number of species groups secured to a persistence threshold of 30%. Why so low? Only 30% confidence they're going to be around in 20 years? This speaks to the amount of uncertainty that when these managers are trying to make predictions about how well all these actions will do, and they're thinking about climate change, and they're thinking about new disease introductions, and they're thinking about new invasive species introductions. Even if they take the actions that are being proposed, they just couldn't say with a lot of confidence that, yeah, it's silver bullet, they're going to be around in 20 years. So that's why that's so low. But for a lot of species, it moves them from guaranteed extinction to, hey, 30% chance of persistence, right? So it's a good thing. So what I want to put in perspective for you is we can secure all 16, and 16 because we're not quite done yet, this is preliminary results, all 16 taxonomic groups for the cost of 4 fighter jets. That's 20 years of jobs, 20 years of being out there managing species across 4 islands is the cost of 4 fighter jets. To put this in perspective at a slightly smaller scale, during the Hawaii Conservation Conference, they announced $14 million from the federal government to go and help solve the forest bird crisis. Okay, $14 million. 2 days later, they announced $25 million to extend a road on Maui by 2,900 feet. Okay, so we have got to stop apologizing for what it takes to save species for our children and grandchildren and great-great-grandchildren to enjoy. If we break this down by species group, but for vertebrates, we could get them to the 40% persistence threshold for the low price of $50 million over 20 years. So, you know, 2 2,900-foot extensions of a road on Maui. And for invertebrates, we could get them to the 50% persistence threshold for $600 million. What I want to, in plants to $500 million to the 30% persistence threshold. What this speaks to, notice this is the same number as for all species combined. This is because of co-benefits. And this is one of the huge benefits of a process like this. It's not just about taking this and putting it in a proposal to now go get more grant money. It's getting folks working better across silos and across sectors and talking to one another. As we got people in rooms together, it was pretty amazing how much we realized that the forest bird folks and the plant folks and the insect folks and the snail folks had no clue about what was really causing extinction in the other groups and what things they could be doing to co-benefit them as they're out there anyways getting dropped off by helicopter to do management. So by bringing folks together, you can't just fence everything. Just fencing stuff alone is a place to start, but it doesn't get you everywhere you need to go. So our initial impressions, we just had another workshop yesterday. We were having trouble getting the final worksheets out of everyone for the benefits because everyone's scared to make these predictions, right? Really hard to sit down and make these predictions, thinking about how what you're doing every day, what difference is it actually making over a 20-year time span? And so we had to get everyone in a room, and then they gave us the worksheets more or less. So our initial impressions from the first set of results. There's high uncertainty amongst the managers, even for species considered to be recovering today. So when we looked at like the waterbird numbers, they were pretty low, and we couldn't figure out why. Because waterbirds, we kind of know how to save them. It's just a predator issue and habitat limitation, more or less. There's some botulism issues too, but it's mostly predators and habitat limitations. And so why were those folks estimating it so low? Well, our models have shown that sea level rise is going to make 30% of all existing waterbird habitat disappear by end of century, right? Now, if you restore low-E, by the way, you can gain 130% of that back. So there's some solutions. So again, we're like, hey, solutions exist, but there's so much uncertainty, folks are just really nervous. Ungulate fences and predator control are really critical components of all of the plans that achieve threshold levels of persistence. And finally, this is a call for help to all of you. Plants, insects, and forest birds have huge research needs. Just huge research needs. The plant folks are just overwhelmed. The insect folks are just overwhelmed with the amount of research that's needed. And the forest birds with the avian malaria and mosquito issue need a lot of help as well. So the future is here. What can you as researchers contribute? I would like to encourage you, first of all, to co-develop your research projects with managers. For something to truly be conservation research, it needs to actually make a difference in moving the needle for them. So without sitting down with them and saying, what problems are you actually running into, your research is not going to be aimed where it needs to be aimed. When I first started talking with managers and they found out I was a geneticist, they're like, oh yeah, we've had this thing we've been curious about for a long time. Can you do this genetics project for us? And having just gotten started training in decision analysis, I said, well, if I tell you this thing is super inbred versus super genetically diverse, what are you going to do differently? Says, oh, nothing. We're actually predators are the problem. We're just really curious about this genetic thing. We've been wondering about it for a while. I said, well, I actually have a behavioral ecology background too. What can I do for you on the predators? Can we develop a project around that that's actually going to make a difference for you? Be a matchmaker and team builder. Maybe what you're going to find is that the thing that, we're often as researchers, a hammer looking for a nail. Right? And if it's not a nail, we still hit it with a hammer anyways, right? And so basically, if you recognize that the thing they're really running into an issue with is not a problem you can solve with your particular toolkit, but you know someone across campus or you know someone across the water who can help, be a matchmaker, connect them. And maybe you can stay involved, especially if you're a local researcher and they're not. You can help them appropriately apply their stuff to Hawaii, but importantly, build teams to solve these problems. Develop and test mental models. These folks are on the landscape every single day. They have a lot of ideas, a lot of time hiking in the wilderness to think about these problems. And so they have a lot of ideas. Sit with them, help them map out their mental models, see what those differences are between the managers. And this often points you toward really interesting hypotheses to test. Importantly, your research has to be situated at the spot that connects actions and outcomes. If your research is not situated there, it is not moving the needle. It's of interest, it's of theoretical interest, but it's not going to move the needle on the most important thing, which is reproduction and survival. These species are declining rapidly. If you can't bump up reproductive success and you can't bump up survival, they go extinct. So start there, and then there might be some other interesting things along the way that you can spin off on the side. But if it's actually conservation aimed research, sit it squarely aimed at improving reproductive and survival success. We need to work with engineers and inventors. The problems often are not necessarily that we don't know what the problem is, but we need, like, you know, with the Wolbachia mosquitoes, they had to figure out how to sort male from female mosquitoes at scale to be able to release millions of male mosquitoes across the landscape, which, by the way, don't bite. They're the same species that's already here. Wolbachia are already in them. There's nothing crazy GMO-ish happening about it, right? But they had to figure out how to sort male from female mosquitoes. There's a whole lot of things that you're going to need to work with people maybe outside your specific area of expertise to solve these problems. Speaking of, we need social science, marketing, and human dimensions to actually solve these problems. If you figure out the silver bullet solution, but there's not social acceptance and social adoption of these ideas, you haven't solved the problem. So you've got to be, you know, professors, if your students are like, love biology, you want to go into marketing, say, great, come back and collaborate with me. Let's figure out how to do these things together. But we need the social scientists, and we need them grounded in good science. We need them to understand the problems well so they can accurately communicate them. So I want to leave you with a couple of thoughts. One, collaborate, innovate, dream big. These problems are not small. The time for small solutions has passed. We have to be thinking really big, landscape scale, and solving the really big problems if we want something to hand off to our children and grandchildren. In an era filled with uncertainty, our solutions need to be as big and as multidimensional as the challenges that we are facing. A few years ago at Hawaii Conservation Conference, I started getting a little bit frustrated that most talks were beginning with the fact that Hawaii was the extinction capital of the world, as if this was an immutable fact that was going to stay the same forever and ever. And so I started saying, hey, you know, I just got tenure, turned 45 this year. By the time I retire, I mean, I've got mentors who are in their 80s and still going to work every day, right? So I've got 40 years to work on this. By the time I retire, I would like to see us transform from the extinction capital of the world to the recovery capital of the world. And I hope that by showcasing to you today that not only do we have big problems, but the solutions exist to solve these problems. And if you keep getting up each day and doing what you do, and I keep getting up each day and doing what I do, we can solve these problems together. So with that, I will take any of your thoughts, ideas, or questions. Yes.
Really fantastic talk. I was just wondering, how did you go about determining the costs of all of these specific, you know, ways to do better conservation management? What was it like to combine all of that? What sources did you like get to determine what was the cost of it in the first place?
Yeah, great question. So for the online audience, the question was, how do we determine costs for this? So I skipped over a lot of methods on the presentation today for the sake of time, but the basic idea is it's through a series of elicitation workshops. And so the second workshop in the series is typically on costing and feasibility. So at that point, we've packaged up more or less the broad categories of actions. We sit down with the managers broken out into small groups. They can choose which one they go to, but we've had a total of about 80 to 100 participants so far. And we sit down and say, okay, you're building a fence. Take us through from your planning stage all the way to monitoring the fence line after you've eradicated the ungulates from inside the fence, that entire process. What's it cost? What are your materials? And they're like, oh, well, it's this much for the planning stage. It's this much for this. It's this much for that. So, I mean, it really was nitty gritty, everything from, and we have a parallel process that's being led by Lucas Fertini, Christina Leopold, and Fred Amadon that is doing the spatial portion of things. And they weren't ready, essentially, for us to be totally spatially explicit in things. So we needed things scaled so that we could then scale it appropriately once they identify the footprint that we're dealing with. So, you know, it might be like, here's the cost per trap. You need this many traps per area for this size of population. And yeah, my postdoc is amazing. It's working on this. Kristen Harmon, she finished her PhD working on water birds in my lab and has shifted over to this. Did that answer your question? Yeah. Okay. Other questions? Yeah.
Are there any efforts to make like an information clearinghouse for sharing conservation? Like information can be shared with brainstorm?
So yeah, I should have included a link in here. Division of Forestry and Wildlife actually a few years back developed a list of research needs. It's a little bit of a laundry list, a wish list of a really big list of things. And I think they have varying degrees of need as far as like how big of a difference would it make if you knew this versus that. I think there's a wide range on that list, but it does exist and it's on their website and I can forward it to you if you're interested in it. That's a list of research needs. As far as species status, it's challenging. There's, you know, if you even want GIS information, they make you sign your life away because there's people who go collect the last of a plant, the seeds, they'll go stomp, even if they're careful, they're like stomping around it and smashing seedlings because they don't know it's an endangered plant. There are people who go take snail selfies, like there's crazy stuff. And so I know that they're a little bit protective of the geographic information, but as far as trends go, I know presentations have been given for years. This is actually the first part of this was a compilation from a symposium that we pulled together at HCC a couple years ago. So we've been putting a huge effort out into raising awareness. My former student, Lucas Zavas, is now communications coordinator for the Birds Not Mosquitoes program. And she has a whole Instagram handle and social media and stuff that she's trying to get word out about the forest bird stuff all the time. So clearinghouse, yeah, no. And I think part of it is it's a little overwhelming to the managers to keep up with something like that. Even to put all of this into a publishable paper, they're unwilling to kind of commit to numbers. So I haven't been able to get to that point for even this information to kind of raise the alarm. So we're figuring out ways to do that. Did I answer your question? Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
As I see that spreadsheet you're talking about,
Yeah.
it's really general.
Mhm.
Students looking for a project, they want to do something that's going to be useful. What steps can they take to build those connections or find these people?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I would really encourage the PIs to develop the relationships and that you're here for a long time. And so being able to have a list in your phone that, you know, you've talked with them before, you saved their number, you've got it to pick up and call. I started off when I was doing my postdoc and I got hired in a half-time assistant professor position, instructional and NREM, non-tenure track. And the department basically told me, like, if we ever get a tenure track position, you're not going to be able to compete for it if it's just snails. So I was like, okay, I got to expand. So I started asking what folks weren't working on too much. And so folks put me in touch first with Jason Misaki, the wildlife coordinator for Oahu Forestry and Wildlife. And, you know, he clued me into some stuff with the water birds, I think was what folks had directed me to first with him. Then I sat down with him in his office and he has this lineup of bullets along his cabinet. And he's a hunter in addition to being the wildlife manager for the islands and dealing with conservation stuff. And he's like, you know, I really need distribution maps to take to the Senate and ask them to expand hunting areas. And so we then developed those two projects, you know, started the water bird stuff and then started the ungulate distribution models, which were, it takes about 2 years per island. And we're trying to produce value neutral products that can be used for hunting, conservation, and agricultural purposes to minimize impacts of invasive ungulates and also increase hunting access and to areas that need reductions in ungulates. So yeah, I think just starting those conversations as a PI, and that way when you have a student come along and say, you know, I really am interested in this particular thing, you kind of have, I always have kind of this list of projects in the back of my mind stewing, that when a student comes along interested in a particular thing, I'm like, oh yeah, we've been thinking about this for a while. Like I talked to a student this morning, she's working for USDA APHIS while doing school, and she actually is working on disease stuff with them, like processing pig samples for brucellosis and stuff like that. And so, you know, it's like, oh, we've actually been trying to brew this project working on leptospirosis and diseases transmitted by pigs and other things. The impacts on people who work in Lo'i, which have a really high leptospirosis risk. And so there's kind of an intersection of pigs and water birds and all these different things that I work on. And so we have pulled together a team of CDC, the National APHIS Swine Task Force. And it's like folks just start putting you in touch with other folks. But the problem is that they don't respond to students. So like even my postdoc, she'll be like, yeah, I'm not getting a response from this person. I've got two options. And I'm like, okay, am I CC'd, not CC'd? Okay, CC me first. A lot of times just by CCing me, all of a sudden she gets a response. And then, but also if they're not getting a response, I have their number in my phone. I can pick up the phone. Hey, my student's been trying to reach you. What's going on? Are you interested in this? You know, do you want to work on this? Or, and typically even before the student reaches out, I'll have had a phone call with them to understand what their needs are, because the students they're not ready to have those conversations to really drill down and understand the combination of tools that you know exist for research. What's possible, sample sizes, the kind of access you need. You know, do you already have the permits in lab or not? And so if you have that initial phone call with folks, it's a lot easier, and definitely be present for the meetings with them. I don't know, does that answer your question?
I think we could be doing more, right?
Yeah.
To maybe connect them.
Yeah, so Suzanne Case, who was the chairperson of DLNR, just got hired as in Basilis's office as director. What's her position title? Director of Land and Water Conservation. It's a new position, right? And so I know she's really interested in doing that and facilitating that. One of the things I suggested to her is, you know, there's been pots of anywhere from 50,000 to 300 some thousand that have funded these different water burden pig projects and FOIO projects, different things like that my lab has done. And I said, you know, rather than they just developed them with me because they knew me and I was talking to them. And they're like, oh yeah, I've got this pot of money. Or, oh, some even like, well, why aren't you doing that anymore? I said, well, we've got a grant from the Marine Corps base to study water birds. My team has to be over there because that's what they're getting paid to do. And so first thing Lindsay Nietman did when she came into the position at Kauai is wrote a grant so that we could go back and actually track chicks and do the things that she wanted to see happening at the marsh there. So sometimes they write grant proposals for you, but I talked to Suzanne, I said, well, what if you talk with them and say, okay, these things that are really important, that are really holding you back from making good management decisions, find the money for, you know, $100,000, $200,000 grant, something that a PI might see as, okay, that'll fund a graduate student for 2 years and the supplies they need and mileage reimbursement, conference travel and stuff like that. And then oftentimes the PI can go out and apply for an NSF, but now that they've done the pilot project, they're going to be competitive for the NSF or something. So you're not just always going to DOFA and saying, give me more money for research, but with that investment up front, they can, you know, we then can go and apply for broader funds to dig deeper into these topics. So we'll see. She's spinning on different things. She was talking about doing a workshop to connect managers and researchers, kind of like we did a few years ago with the genetics workshop out at HIMB, something like that. Yeah. Yeah.
You know, I think parallel work happening in
You mean as far as like the decision analysis stuff?
Yeah.
That's a really good question. In the Hawaiian Islands, to my knowledge, like there's been 3 of us trained. Kirsten Olson, who definitely does work in the marine realm on decision analysis, and she's an economist and engineer by training, as a side note. Then Evan Paxton as well, and then myself. So the 3 of us did the training out at NCTC. We have as our capstone class with undergrads, they all learn how to do it. So NREM 494, they all do a team project and on the way out the door, learn how to do some decision analysis. So sometimes there's some marine stuff, but as far as large scale marine things, I think they're largely in the realm of like marine protected area planning are the typical things that you see. But there's so much more that could be done around fishing. So we have new positions. There's a cluster hire across the university for fisheries. And our department has one of them, and we've made it a decision analysis fisheries position. So coming soon to a department near you. Here's hoping. Yes.
It's really great, Melissa. I mean, sad, but really great to know this stuff put together. You're asking us to dream big and think big, and sort of we're out of time for stuff that's smaller on a smaller scale. But is this still time and space for a more theoretical framework to be developed or to be used later in applied research, or do you think we sort of hit a point where all of our research should have applications? Like that's just what has to come out of our work as well as in the theoretical.
Yeah, that's a really hard question in that I know where I've devoted my life's work and what motivates me and gets me up in the morning. And I think each researcher has to make that decision for themselves, right? So without theoretical research and non-applied research, oftentimes we wouldn't even make discoveries that are needed that we didn't even know we're going to apply to this other thing, right? So it's not that the theoretical research isn't important. So I think there's a place for it. And I think individually, as students finishing, as postdocs finishing, there's just a decision about where you want to put your energy and time. And so, you know, personally for me, this is what gets me up each day. And I get really excited about it, about making a difference. It's also really hard. I know a whole bunch of people across the field that have just straight experienced ecological depression. One person who was involved used to be employed by Pixie, which was essentially disbanded under the Trump administration. And he told me, he's like, actually, it's been kind of a relief because I was going home pretty depressed every day because he was running climate change models every day. That's all he did. And he was like, it's pretty depressing going home and thinking about the future I'm handing off to my daughter. And so it was a relief not to do that every single day, even though it's a lot of what he does still. So, you know, it's not the easiest work on the planet, and it may not be where someone's brain is at, right? So I think it's a personal choice. I can't say what everyone else needs to do. I just try to inspire everyone to go work on this stuff. Yeah. Yeah.
Hi, I'm interested in the management actions that your group identified that might benefit multiple taxonomic groups or birds or invertebrates or, or plants. And if your group tried to share some of those management actions between groups that might be funded or just focused on one of the taxonomic groups.
Yeah, great question. And I wish I had time to unpack it a little bit more. We are hoping to have our final analyses done on this by the end of December. So we'll unpack it a lot more by then. We'll have a published paper, hopefully, you know, submitted around February, very optimistically, or something like that, right? The basic idea, so just a little bit of background on this. So you go through what's called the Delphi method. Delphi method, everyone individually makes projections on the benefits, predictions about the benefits for each of those taxonomic groups that they consider themselves to be an expert in. November 9, we'll actually have a share out of everyone. We'll get in a room together and we'll show for each of those strategies. And there's like 17, and then there's combo things. So it's a lot. We'll show for each of those strategies what folks put. And then you have an opportunity for folks to say, well, why would there have been a value this high, or why would there have been a value this low, and have a conversation. One of the reasons we didn't break that out by a taxonomic group, grabbing everyone in the room together, is so they can actually see how the actions they might take aimed at forest birds, if that's their hat, might co-benefit the insects or the snails or something that are in their habitat, that there's experts in the room that have provided that information. So we do have experts across those areas. It's been really hard to find enough insect experts, enough plant experts, and enough aquatic invertebrate experts. It's been a struggle to get enough people to fill those sheets out, which just exemplifies the challenges we're facing. But yeah, the goal is to get folks working together. Scott Fretz, who's the branch manager for Division of Forestry and Wildlife, he signs off on everyone's grants, right? He signs off on everyone's management plans, sitting at the top of Division of Forestry and Wildlife. So there's benefits of everyone being in the room together during these processes, but as we do our share outs, we're also wanting to unpack the co-benefits. Did I answer your question?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah.
A few questions online.
Yeah.
Somebody asked that if you had reason to consider everything, what criteria would you use to decide how to prioritize? Would you prioritize ecological function, evolution and uniqueness, or something else?
Oh, that's a great question. If we had money to do everything that's in our project, which is aimed at saving endangered species, would we still have the goal be saving endangered species? Is that the question? So I'm going to step back a little bit from that question and say that so the type of decision analysis I was trained in is called values-focused decision-making. The reason it's called values-focused decision-making is you actually start, after you initially frame things up, you say, okay, what's the geographic scope of the problem you're facing? Who's the decision maker who has authority to implement the set of actions that are going to be identified? You don't want to be saying, well, here's the silver bullet. Well, that's nice and all, but that person over there is in charge of it and we didn't involve them in the process. That's a problem, right? So who has authority to implement? What's the time horizon over which we judge success as well as implementation? So there's all these criteria that essentially make the box so everyone's on the same page as you're talking about the decision. The next thing you do is say, how do we judge success? So we might ask questions like, if you came back in 50 years and you saw the outputs of this and you were really happy about it, what would you see? What would it look like? If you came back in 50 years and you're like, oh my goodness, this is a disaster, this is awful, you know, what would that look like? And so by kind of identifying your greatest hopes and your greatest fears and asking some other follow-up questions along the realm of not only economic, not only ecological, but also social and cultural values, you can get what are called, we call them objectives. So basically they're the values by which you judge success. And then we say, well, how would you measure that? So maybe it's like, you know, native plant cover, or maybe it's food production, or maybe it's water flow or something like that. So you have all these different things that might matter. And so the answer to your question is a little bit tough in that for me, on this particular project, we worked really hard with the managers to boil it down to just 2 objectives, not because the other things didn't matter to us, but because it already was so complicated that if you start adding in all these other value metrics, you can't get anything done. You can't have a point. And so we boiled it down to gains in persistence per dollar spent. So it doesn't mean that the other things don't matter. There's actually 3 legs of this project. The 3rd leg is looking at landscape scale restoration. We're really pushing, we meaning me, I think John Price, no relation, is also pushing for it, but trying to, there's a lot of prices in conservation, I don't know why. Trying to push for them to really look at partnership with communities. And if you look at kind of land parcel ownership and authority, who has authority to implement, and you have developed kind of a map of like, if someone came to me and they have got a community group and they want to work in this area because it's in their backyard for some reason, what would you tell them what to plant there? You know, it's that kind of thing. So we're really pushing for them to kind of move that direction. Division of Forestry and Wildlife only manages 20% of the lands across the state. 20% of the lands across the state are managed as ranch lands. So I'm a vegetarian, but I was at the Cattlemen's Council meeting last week presenting on an economics analysis that came out of one of the projects, not an economist, partner with people who do, to figure out the impacts to ranches from invasive ungulates. Because the folks were telling us when we did a Pueo project with ranchers, they're like, we love Pueo and all, but the access deer are going to put us out of business in 10 years. What can you do to help us with that? And so we've got an economics project as well as a field project for that. So it's a very long-winded way of saying, while I have personal things that motivate me and native species just make me happy. I'm going for the open day at Hakalau tomorrow, first flight out so that I can spend the whole day. I've never been to Hakalau. It's like the last kind of Noah's Ark spot of like a bunch of endangered birds. I'm getting to go there for the first time tomorrow. Those just make me happy. But when I'm working with managers or with communities, I'm always starting by asking them what's important to them and then trying to make sure that we keep those things in mind and that we look for shared solutions. Because if people aren't motivated, they don't take action. I think we're at time. Yeah. All right. Thank you. My pleasure. Thank you so much.